thank you very, very much for being here. Does this work all right? Get it up closer? Down, is that better? Halfway.
Just project. Project.
Okay. Is that working all right? No. It's not working all right. Okay. Can you hear me in the back? Okay.
Can you hear me in the back now?
Yes.
This is a good example of what we're talking about. It's the application of systematic common sense. If the thing that's supposed to project doesn't project as well as projecting without the thing, then you give up the thing. I don't want to get too far away from Iowa Public Radio. I was going to go around front and I thought, no, that would mess up the shooting. So, I'm going to give a very focused chat tonight. It's not like normal political talks, all right? I want to first of all commend all of you, and I'm going to commend Michael George, who put in his personal money to do something that's really hard. To take an abstract idea and move it into the political dialogue when every element of the political dialogue resisted. And so your being here tonight is a big deal. We all understand how to be for candidates, and we sort of understand the ideological fights of the last 40 years. But for citizens to say they're going to come out and work to communicate a new idea, that is a big deal. And we are, one of the reasons we've been successful for 225 years is that we are the most open to new ideas of any country in the world. Now, test question, since I used to teach history. What happened in Council Bluffs in 1859 that was of great political and historic significance?
Lincoln.
Lincoln. And what did Lincoln do? He looked across the river and he said he was committed to a transcontinental railroad. Now let me tell you how amazing this is. Abraham Lincoln is born in 1809. He runs for office for the first time at 23 years of age. The railroad is invented in 1829 when Stephenson builds the rocket in Great Britain. The first railroad engine arrives in the U.S. in 1831. In 1832, Abraham Lincoln has as part of his platform building a railroad. Now, he's never seen a railroad, but he has seen flat land, and he has walked lots of miles. And being relatively smart, he has figured out having a train pull you across that area would be faster than walking. So the same visionary shows up here 27 years later. And now railroads are common. It's very chaotic, by the way, but common. Lincoln rides, I think, on 7 different railroads in order to go from Springfield to New York in February of 1860. And he has to literally get off one railroad to get on another railroad because that's how they've been built. Now, why am I telling you this? Because in Lincoln's generation, they understood that technological change was the key to a better future. They understood that steamboats were important. I mean, it's one thing to take a barge down the Mississippi. It's really hard to pole a barge up the Mississippi. Steamboats were liberating. Railroads were liberating. The telegraph was liberating. We've gone through a cultural cycle starting in the 1960s where we have given up on learning new things in our political process. Our political process, one of the reasons I'm running for president is I got so tired out of a decade of trying to advise people in both parties on obvious, simple, common sense. So I regard Strong America Now is one of the most hopeful citizen efforts. I hope it spreads to all 50 states. I hope it spreads to affecting the state government, the local government, the federal government, and I hope it becomes part of the pattern of the next 20 years as we fundamentally change government. Now, let me describe to you two areas to think about. I was a student of Edwards Deming. I took a 60-hour tutorial. I studied Peter Drucker starting in the late 1960s. I actually had a workshop on applying Six Sigma to government in the late 1980s and brought in Motorola and Cadillac and Ritz-Carlton and Southwire and actually had them talk about it. And so this is a topic where I feel passionate about what you're doing. And I'm going to break it into two parts. I'm going to break it into the technical side and the common sense side. The simple language I use is to say there's a world that works and there's a world that fails. And government, politicians, and the news media all have learned the world that fails. And they are impervious to new ideas. They wonder why they exist. They find it strange and hard to deal with. Let me give you an example. How many of you have ever gone online to check a package at UPS or FedEx to see where it is? Raise your hand. Most of the audience, right? How many of you think you may even do that this Christmas? All right? So if I describe to you a technology that allows you at no extra cost to track a package while it's moving, this is not a theory, correct? Correct. This actually exists. That's the world that works. Between them, UPS and FedEx move 24 million packages a day and track them in virtually real time. Over here is the federal government, the world that fails. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. 24 million packages tracked while they move. 11 million illegal visitors sitting still. One of my proposals is very simple. We send a package to every person who's here illegally. When it's delivered, we pull it up, we know exactly where they are. Now, I mean, you know that I'm not, and let me just say for our friends in the press, that was called hyperbole, it's humor. I don't want some New York Times columnist saying, "Does Gingrich so stupid he really thinks you can," how would you identify them? Because they can't deal with new ideas. Second example. How many of you have ever been called by a credit card company to make sure you were actually charging? Raise your hand if you've ever been called. So again, let me make this case. This is not a theory. The credit card companies have massive expert systems that track in real time the probabilities of whether it's fraud or it's the actual customer. American Express does it so well that they pay 0.03 of 1% to crooks. The federal government does it so badly. World that works, world that fails. They do it so badly that the New York Times estimated that New York State Medicaid paid over 10% of its money to crooks. Now, I'm not talking about a doctor who marginally upskills. I'm talking about a dentist who filed 982 procedures a day. I'm talking about a dental office in Brooklyn that had somebody stand up front who said, "If you'll loan us your Medicaid card for 30 seconds, we'll give you a free DVD player." Now here's a question you have to ask yourself. Since we published a book at the Center for Health Transformation. This is part of my frustration. This is part of why I'm running. The book had a title that I thought even in Washington they would get. It was called "Stop paying the crooks. Now you would think, for example, if you were the so-called super committee, that you would go, oh yes, I found a place to save money. Let's not pay crooks. No hope. Just no hope. Because in order to stop the crooks, you have to fundamentally go to a modern information age payment system. No bureaucrat at the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services understands a modern system. And so what you have is paper-based bureaucrats who go home at 5 trying to keep up with crooks who own iPads. It's absolutely impossible. How much is involved? $70 to $120 billion a year in Medicare and Medicaid. We have no idea how much in food stamps. Remember, this is the best food stamp president in history. So more Americans today get food stamps than before, and we now give it away as cash. You don't get food stamps. You get a credit card, and the credit card can be used for anything. We've had people take their food stamp money and use it to go to Hawaii. And they give food stamps now to millionaires. Because after all, don't you want to be compassionate? Isn't there, the Obama model, isn't there somebody you'd like to give money to this week? That's why we're now going to help bail out Italy, because, we haven't bailed out enough people this week. The president thought, oh, let's write another check, because after all, we have so much extra money. Now, let me carry a step further. If you take, this is why I'm so excited by Strong America Now. If you insist on modernizing, the first thing you do is just look at things that work. And you take them and you bring them into the federal government. I was at a plant in New Hampshire that manufactures parts for the auto industry. They manufactured 2 million of a particular part last year, and they had one mistake in 2 million. Their goal this year is 2 million with 0 mistakes. Now let me suggest to you, if we just took this room and formed a citizens audit committee, and you went, say, to the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and you said, we'd like to find your best office to see how close you come to one mistake in every 2 million. It's an embarrassment. We don't have to tolerate the government being stupid. And it's expensive. So that's part one. Part two. And this is something I actually am not sure that Michael, George, and the others fully understand. The only way you go to Lean Six Sigma in the federal government is you end the 130-year-old civil service model, and you end the current internal regulatory model that makes it impossible to manage the government. And what does that mean? It means you say to every federal employee, there's going to be a metric for your job. If you want to understand metrics better, you can read Giuliani's terrific book on leadership. You can read Chief Bratton's book called Turnaround, on how they applied metrics in New York City to stop crime. They brought crime down by 75% under Giuliani by applying metrics to how they manage the police force. Or you can read Moneyball, which is how Billy Beane actually applied metrics to the Oakland Athletics. Now what does metrics mean? It means you say to yourself, why did we hire this person? What is it we want them to do? How will we measure whether or not they're doing it? How will we get them to change if they're not doing it very well? I actually went out to Los Angeles and spent a day with Chief Bratton watching how they applied it to the Los Angeles Police Department, sitting in meetings. I had this police sergeant who had been assigned the most crime-ridden mall in Los Angeles, had been his assignment. And he walked in and he spent an hour briefing us on how he had approached it, how he had thought it through, how they had fixed it. At the very end, he came over to meet me after it was all over, and he said, I was taking a course at the University of Phoenix on planning, and it was really helpful in doing this. This is a police sergeant, 29 years old, applying intelligence to fundamentally changing things. If you went to the Department of Labor, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and you actually insisted that people do their jobs, which meant first you had to define their jobs, you would have such a radical breakthrough in competence And you'd learn pretty rapidly who wasn't competent, who needed to be retrained. I'm not for firing people in phase one. I am for retraining them, but being quite clear. We actually are hiring you for a reason. You're getting money to do something. If you are uninterested in doing something, you need to quit getting money. Now, let me give you the one place where I intellectually think that I approach this differently than Strong America now has, and I'm hoping that this will help convince them to change. The power of moving to an agile, accurate, metrics-based, effective federal government that is constantly learning, constantly evolving, constantly improving, isn't just that you save money on waste. It's that you fundamentally transform how the government does business. I'll give you 3 examples. We have a terrible system today for visas for people who want to visit the United States legally. I think the number now in Brazil is it takes a 174-day wait. Now, the amount of money that costs Disney World is amazing. The amount of difficulty it costs in businesses because you can't get the visa to come here to do business. And so, all of us who are worried about illegal immigration should also worry about legal visitors, because we'd like to make it cheaper and easier to come here legally and then go home than it is to come here illegally. If you apply Lean Six Sigma, the first result you get is not only do you save money on the visa system internally, but you suddenly dramatically expand American commerce, American tourism, American business, because you have a better system moving faster. Second example. It's almost inconceivable that we have a National Aeronautics and Space Administration which spends billions of dollars a year, which managed to be planned so badly that we currently have no lift vehicle to go into space. I mean, ask yourself, how could you run a multi-billion-dollar department to go into space and actually have a multi-year gap where you have no vehicle? I mean, doesn't it make you kind of wonder what they're all sitting around doing? I think they're thinking of space. You know, you have meetings where you have space thoughts. You go to conferences where you reflect on space. But this is just, I mean, this is such bad planning and such bad management that it's an embarrassment to the United States. I'm going to give you 2 last examples. On sheer effectiveness, we can build, and I have in the 21st Century Contract with America at Newt.org, that we will complete total control of the border by January 1, 2014. Now, you can't do that under current federal law. It's physically impossible to go through all the red tape, all the regulations, all the hearings, all the thises, all the that's. And yet we fought World War II from December 7th, 1941, when the Japanese attacked us, to August 1945, when they surrendered. In 3 years and 8 months, we defeated fascist Italy, Nazi Germany, and Imperial Japan. We built the Pentagon in 18 months. Now we're so muscle-bound that it has been 25 years since Ronald Reagan wrote in his diary, we have to get control of the border, and we still don't have a control of the border. Yeah. So we're writing a bill that'll be at Newt.org early next spring, which is very simple. It is modeled off of Lean Six Sigma. It says we are suspending all federal regulations and all federal requirements for the purpose of giving a grant of authority on a World War II model to build the total control of the border within 12 months, period. Last example. The current Food and Drug Administration is a disaster. What's happened is, over a 40-year period, it's grown more bureaucratic, more hostile to new ideas, more reactionary, more out of touch with modern science. This doesn't just have an internal waste problem. This means if a brand new idea is developed in the laboratory, the odds are more and more likely it's going to be actually brought to market in China, or in Europe, or in Japan, or in India. because it is too expensive to bring it to market here. When Jonas Salk developed the polio vaccine, the first year he developed it, he gave it to his own family to test safety. The following year, 1,400,000 Americans volunteered to be part of the study. The year after that, they vaccinated the whole country. Today, that would take about 20 years and $1 billion, because the Food and Drug Administration is so destructive. So one of the side benefits of applying Lean Six Sigma to FDA is going to be to build a modern system where you start with the idea that the FDA should be in the laboratory understanding the science, and they should accelerate it getting to the patient, not stop it. When you start doing that, this is a very fundamental change in government. This is moving from the government as adversary to the government as collaborators. And what it's designed to say is that in the long run, we want to dominate the world health market, creating the best new breakthroughs in medicine, medical technology, medical devices, so that Americans live longer at lower cost with greater independence, and we create hundreds of thousands of American jobs selling worldwide American science because we accelerate getting it to market, we don't stop it. That's why I say to you, Lean Six Sigma is not just about saving money, it's about empowering all of American society to reach the fullest possible life and to have the greatest possible productivity. It's the biggest single idea about how to manage the federal government since the rise of the Civil Service Commission in the 1880s. That's how big I think this is, and that's why your being here really matters. Now, one last thing, which is politically, I'll take questions for a minute if I'm allowed to.
Yes.
One last thing for all of you. Politics is really simple. Who shows up on January 3rd? How long do they stay? And how well do they argue with the folks who are undecided? You have a chance with your friends and neighbors to make history, because virtually every political reporter in America is going to be here. And if they say, you know, it was amazing how many precincts there were people who cared about Lean Six Sigma and people who represented Strong America Now, and I am fascinated with this emerging new movement, you will literally, on the 4th and 5th of January, have begun to move the political dialogue of America in a way that nobody I know of in the last 20 years has been able to do. It's an extraordinary opportunity, and I really am grateful to all of you for taking time to be here.
Just real quick before you start the questions, I am going to have the people start bringing the pizza out, but it's not until the question and answer is over. But it's free pizza for you. Please help yourself, and be courteous to your neighbors as far as answering the questions. Make sure you raise your hands and so on and so forth.
I don't want to say which federal agency my daughter works for, but it's a prestigious federal agency in the Department of Justice. And she's young. She was just hired. And as you talked, it just hit my heart, because she said, Mom, this is a very prestigious federal agency, and it's great for my resume to work here, but I'm getting lazy. I am so lazy because they won't let me work late to get my work done. They want to transfer, people that can't do their job in, and she wants to leave. I mean, leave, because she said she feels like it's lazy, and it's the Department of Justice. It's a very important function. How can we change that?
That is what this is about. If we win, if the concept, if we basically end the civil service laws and end the federal regulatory bureaucracy and move to a Lean Six Sigma model, overnight that'll change. Because the fact is, this is a very hard thing to remember. I used to tell people 10 years ago, if you took the 20 smartest people at FedEx and the 20 smartest people in the federal government, and you swap their jobs, within 90 days, the people from the federal government would be more productive, more energetic, more entrepreneurial, and the people from FedEx would be learning how to be less productive, less effective. And I said, this is a systems problem. We have created a system which protects the incompetent, is anti-work, refuses to measure productivity, has all sorts of internalized rules against accuracy, and it produces exactly what a culture like that will produce. That's why this is such an important concept and so vital that we get strong. I talk about Strong America now in every state I go to, because I think the concept is so central to our future.
It's argued that manufacturing created probably the most wealth in the middle class over the last half century, but now it's leaving America is causing the demise of the middle class. What do you think we can do to bring manufacturing back to America and revitalize the middle class?
Look, I think that we are capable of being the dominant manufacturing country in the world. That's part of why if you go to Newt.org and you look at the 21st century contract with America, one of the things we have is 100% expensing for all new equipment. So you write it off in 1 year. So whether you're a farmer or a factory or a doctor's office, all new equipment's written off in 1 year with a very specific goal. We want Americans to be the most productive workers in the world. It's the only way to compete with China and have a high value-added job that pays a lot. Second, I think you have to repeal Dodd-Frank and you have to repeal Sarbanes-Oxley because they are crushing American. Third, you have to replace the Environmental Protection Agency with a brand new Common Sense Environmental Solutions Agency because EPA is a killer. One last example, this goes back to how different this is. I'm going to propose very strongly that unemployment compensation only be extended if it has attached to it a training requirement. So if we are paying you money because you don't have a job, you're using your time signing up with a business in order to learn a new trade so that by the time you get done, you actually can be employed. And we should never again pay people 99 weeks for doing nothing.
Lee, you say Lean Six Sigma. I think it's a wonderful, that's why I'm here, because I believe in it as well. I'm very experienced in it. I'm a trained engineer at the corporate level for a large ag chem company that's #1 globally.
You probably narrowed down which company that is.
Yes, you could. But Lean and Six Sigma is very difficult to embed. Very
Yes.
difficult to embed. How do you plan to take that approach with the House and the Senate? Because they're not to be a bunch of old buzzards that have always done everything the way they've done it. How do you plan to change their minds on looking at it as continuous improvement?
Right. Well, you're actually raising a fascinating point, which I have some experience with, which is that you can't talk about modernizing the executive branch unless you're also going to modernize the legislative branch. And we have a provision, if you go and look at the contract, this is a very different contract than the one I wrote in 1994. And the reason is, I spent a lot of time after I left public office thinking about what did not work for Reagan, what did not work for Thatcher, what did not work for me. And I began to realize the exact point. If you don't change the culture, eventually it repudiates you, even if you're doing the right things. Okay? And so, item #1 in my new proposed contract at Newt.org is legislative, the stuff we did in '94. Item #2 is an executive orders on the very first day process that will really dramatically move the government almost overnight. Item #3 is really bold. It is the first training program I know of ever to be proposed that basically says anybody who's going to get a presidential appointment in a Gingrich administration is going to go through an introductory training program and is going to be part of a continuous training program for the entire time that they work with us. Because if you're a corporation, you spend a lot of time developing a corporate culture. We have this habit in the presidency, we pick some nice smart businessman or some nice smart former governor, and we say, you're now in charge of Department X. They have no training, no preparation. We just think, gee, well, they're smart. Well, it's not about being smart. It's about understanding the principles that work. You know, and this is a point that Drucker makes. Drucker makes the point in The Effective Executive, which I think is the best single book ever written about how to be effective. And in The Effective Executive, he says, learning to be effective is a set of habits. It's not genetic, it's not IQ, it's learning to do things. It's like training a cook. You know, it's learning Hard eggs are actually boiled, not put in the freezer. Look, that may seem obvious to all of you, but the truth is, I would argue that you have an administration right now which cannot distinguish. So training is important. One of the things I'm going to do, which I'm not focused on right now because I've got to win the nomination, but I'm going to campaign next year on changing the legislative branch as much as the executive branch, and I'm going to suggest to you that's going to be true across the whole country. That people have got to think beyond their petty committee or their subcommittee or their special deals or their set-asides. And I can tell you, a lot of reforms collapse because it somehow threatens the committee jurisdiction. Well, I think it's time. The only way you're going to change this, I always tell people, I'm never going to ask you to be for me. Because if you're for me, you're going to vote and go home and say, I hope Newt fixes it. And that is impossible. I'm going to ask you to be with me for 8 years because I need you side by side with me saying to the Congress, yes, we're really serious, and yes, we're going to fire you if you don't do these things. That is the only way you're going to get the scale of change you want.
Yeah.
Speaker, when Congresswoman Bachmann was in town, I had an opportunity to ask her a question about immigration, so I'll pose this question to you so I can prepare the answers. But in terms of immigration reform, many of the candidates have talked about stopping the magnets that want people to come to this country. But I feel that some of the greatest magnets are our freedoms and our economic prosperity. And I can understand why so many people would want to come live here and enjoy what we enjoy. And rather than coming here illegally, many choose to just cross the border. But we have limits on the amount of green cards we give out. Would you change that for those who don't have high qualifications, who aren't higher level workers, for just the poor who want to come into our country to enjoy our freedoms, to enjoy our economic prosperity, and help build this country up?
Well, I mean, you raise a really, can all of you hear the question? No. He was asking a very, very intelligent question. He's saying, look, lots of people come here because if you talk about magnets in America, the biggest magnet is freedom. And you think about corrupt dictatorships, you think about very poor countries, and you think, where would you like to be? And it turns out, Gallup estimated recently, if they could get here, you'd have about 300 million show up. Now, the challenge you've got, and that we've all got, is, all right, we're the most open society in the world to legal immigration. We actually accept more legal immigrants than any other country. How much more can you accept? And because we've been so incompetent and so sloppy, we have tolerated a large amount of illegal immigration, which is very bad for us in a lot of different ways. It's bad to break the law. It's bad to have people who are being forced to live outside the law. It sets a terrible standard for citizenship. And so how do you work your way through it? My position has been that you have to, first of all, do a sequence. You cannot do a comprehensive bill. Nobody trusts the federal government enough to allow it to do a comprehensive bill. Bush failed, Obama failed, I wouldn't even try. So there's a series of steps. The first step is you control the border. I just talked to former Congressman Duncan Hunter, who reminded me and said he'd be glad to talk to the press. I actually developed with him the first fence that controlled the border between Tijuana and San Diego, which prior to the fence was in fact the biggest smuggling corridor in the United States. And we imposed it, Clinton signed it in 1996, and it actually worked, but it only was the area between San Diego and Tijuana. So if you went far enough east, there was no fence. But it worked very well, still works today, very well in that area. And we were talking about this. So one, you build the fence, as I said earlier. If you go to newt.org, the commitment is get it done by January 1, 2014, have absolute control of the border. 2, English has to become the official language of government. There are 86 languages spoken in Miami-Dade Community College. There are 200 plus languages spoken in Cook County, which is Chicago. So you have to have a common unifying language, and the only practical common unifying language is English. And just We ought to be clear about it. Not that we're against various languages, not that we disrespect various languages, but in this country, to have a unifying pattern, it has to be this. Third, I think to become an American citizen, you should have a much more stringent American history requirement. So you understand the culture, you understand the history, you understand what has made us who we are. Candidly, I'd have the same requirement to get a high school degree. I think you ought to know American. Fourth, as I said earlier, I would apply Lean Six Sigma to the entire visa program so that if you wanted to come here legally for a brief period of time, you'd come here. And in the process, I would fix the following problem. 20% of the people who are here illegally entered legally on a visa and overstayed. And so we need to think through what's the answer to that piece of this, which is not a controlled offense, because they got in legally, but then they stayed. So we're going to have to work on that. Next, I would apply Lean Six Sigma to the issue of deporting people. If you are a member of MS-13, which is a very dangerous gang, the act of membership should get you deported within a week. We don't, if you're not here legally, we don't have an obligation to put you in. Two last steps. There has to be, in my judgment, there has to be a fairly substantial guest worker program, so when you do have a good economy, there's a legal way to get here to work. I would have a bias in favor of science and technology and engineering. I mean, if somebody graduate from Iowa State or from the University of Iowa with a PhD in mathematics and send them home to India to start a factory, strikes me as not very clever. I'd rather have them start the factory in Ames, okay? Now, so you then have a guest worker program. As part of that, and I would outsource it to American Express, Visa, or MasterCard, because they could actually run one without much fraud. You would not have the federal government administer it. And I would have as a part of that, explicitly, raising dramatically the economic penalties for hiring people illegally. There are no, remember, there are no illegal workers without illegal employers. Now, let's be clear about this. Now, having done all that, where I got in a little bit of controversy the other day, but it's a good controversy. It's how we talk to ourselves as a people. Now, I'm going to be very direct with all of you. I think in the system I just outlined, a vast majority of the people who are currently here illegally will go home. They don't have very deep ties. They were here because they got jobs that were illegal. And so as you build this new system, they in fact have no reason to stay. I also believe, if you look around America, there are people who came here 25 years ago who have been paying taxes, working, have 2 or 3 kids, a couple grandkids, belong to your church. And I don't think we're going to send the police in to break up their family and deport them. That's my personal belief. So how do you deal with that? I want to go back to the World War II selective service model. We had local committees, usually 3 people, usually somebody, a pastor or somebody religious, usually somebody like the banker who was economic, and usually a citizen representative, very often a mother or somebody. So the 3 of them would literally review, so it was real people. It wasn't this some nameless Washington bureaucratic process. If you thought about having a citizen registration board and a process of certification, and a proposal that's been made to me that comes out of the Dutch experience in this country, you might even say, in order to apply, you have to have a family that sponsors you. But if you have somebody who's so deeply into the community that 1 or more families are prepared to sponsor them because they're good citizens, I would not allow them to become an American citizen. I would not allow them to vote. I would allow them to have legal permission to stay in the United States so they come out from the shadows. Their children and grandchildren are a different issue because they're growing up here and they are clearly American. The only other exception I'd make is if you came here as a very young person and you were prepared to serve in the American military. I would give you a path to be a legally registered person and to stay here, because if you're willing to risk your life for this country, we have some obligation to consider you as a person worthy of being here. Now, that would give you a humane solution. And now I want to tell you what the comparison is. I actually believe what I've just outlined is doable. And I believe somebody who comes along and promises you, oh, we're going to kick all of them out. It's not, I don't think it's going to happen. And I don't want to start down a road of policies that have promises that are hopeless. On the other hand, I am totally opposed to amnesty, and I am totally opposed to a system by which people who came here recently have no ties would be allowed to somehow become part of the system. So there is a middle road, I think, that gets us to legality without citizenship.
Last question. I want to go back to something you said just a minute ago. You said we've got to change the legislative branch too. Something new that drives me nuts is this baseline budgeting thing.
Yep.
You get a 5% automatic increase, and if they make it a 3% increase instead of 5%, the media either reports that as a 2% cut or a 40% cut. Drives me nuts. We got to change baseline budgeting. So baseline is what we spent last year.
Right. One of the things that I wish the House Republicans had insisted on as part of the debt ceiling deal was to eliminate the baseline budget. For those who don't understand it, when the Budget Act was written by the Liberals in 1974, they built into it a series of designs for bigger and bigger government. So the scoring mechanisms all favor big government. The way baseline budgeting works, imagine that you had teenage kids and they had a baseline budget for their allowance. And in their mind, their baseline was $10 a month higher every month. So if you gave them a $2 increase, it was actually an $8 cut. Because after all, their baseline said they should get $10. So even though it's going up, it's actually going down. You with me so far? This is why the Congressional Budget Office is a nightmare. It is a reactionary institution of big government liberalism. Its scoring models are all wrong, and it cripples our ability to balance the federal budget. And so I would say one of the first things we would do is abolish baseline budgeting. We would go to what Paul Ryan has called reality-based budgeting. All of you do reality-based budgeting. As you start with, how much did I spend last year? That becomes your new baseline. And sometimes it goes down. I mean, it's interesting to me, how many of you know somebody who's had to give up something in the last 3 years economically? Doesn't this strike you as amazing that the American people have all gone through a process of change, but their government hasn't? That if you said to the government, all we want to do is change your spending patterns by the same percentage as the average American family, it would be a crisis. There'd be heart attacks. And yet families have had to adjust to reality. And so we need to have government have the same courage. Let me just say to all of you, I'm thrilled with what you're doing. I hope you will all be active on January 3rd. I hope you'll get your neighbors and friends to be active. Obviously, I personally would like you to be active for me. But I just think as a matter of citizenship, what you're doing to create a new and brilliant idea is really a big, big deal. Thank you all very much.